Hello and welcome to the latest Insights Live, Creating a Fulfilling Retirement. I'm Susie Allen, Vice President of Insights from Fidelity Wealth Management. Thank you for joining us today and submitting questions. Your questions have helped shape our discussion. Now, to have a satisfying retirement, you need a strong savings and income plan. And you also need to think about your lifestyle, relationships, the emotional aspects, and more. So today, on today's panel, we have both financial professionals and a leading researcher on retirement income and happiness, Dr. Michael Finke, who will share fascinating research on this topic. But before we get going, I want to let you know Fidelity does not give tax or legal advice, and nothing we discuss today should be interpreted as tax or legal advice. The information we are providing is going to be general in nature and it may not apply to your situation. If you do have legal or tax questions about your specific situation, we encourage you to talk to your attorney or tax professional. So let's get going. To kick off, let's introduce our panelists who are here with us today. I'll ask them to introduce themselves and briefly describe their role. So Michael, let's kick it off.
All right. Hello, I'm Michael Finke. I'm a professor of wealth management and the Frank M. Engel Chair of Economic Security at the American College of Financial Services. And before I came to the American College, I was the director of the Retirement Planning and Living Center at Texas Tech University.
Welcome, Michael. Julie.
Hello, I'm Julie Ramos. I am a wealth planner at our Chandler, Arizona Investor Center. I've been with Fidelity for 10 years, in the industry for 17. As a wealth planner, I work with a select group of families doing specialized goal setting and wealth planning.
Excellent. And Justin.
Hi, I'm Justin Bailey. I'm a regional vice president with Fidelity Investments. My role here is I support and coach our Fidelity financial consultants on financial topics like investment management, tax planning, and of course, retirement income planning. And I've been with Fidelity over 27 years, and I am a certified financial planning professional.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you. So let's start our discussion with the research I mentioned a moment ago. Michael, what have your studies uncovered about retirement satisfaction?
Well, let me start out by saying that in my research, I use a survey of 20,000 retirees. It started in 1994. It goes through the current day. And it has very detailed questions on life satisfaction. So I can actually go into the survey and look at the predictors of life satisfaction in retirement. And what I found is that they really cluster it into three different areas. It is money, which is, I think, good news for those of us who have saved for retirement, is having more money does generally make us happier, although it does tend to level out at about $4.5 million or so after that. It's not making us quite as happy, but money makes us happy. Also, the form of money, which is something we'll talk about later. Some people hold wealth in investments, some people hold wealth in pensions. There's a difference between the two when we look at life satisfaction. Also, relationships. Not surprisingly, relationships are a very important predictor of life satisfaction. The relationship that you have with your primary partner or your spouse is the most important relationship that you have in retirement, but also the relationships that we have with our friends. It seems that they become even more important in retirement because we're spending more time in leisure. So we get to draw from those friendships even more than we had in the past. And by the way, children, not a significant source of life satisfaction in retirement. So this has some implications if you're thinking of moving close to your kids. It's really your primary relationship and your friends that are the most important predictors of life satisfaction. And then the third pillar of life satisfaction is health. Obviously, you can have money and you can not have health and not be very satisfied in retirement. So it's really what I see is that all three of those areas can combine satisfaction. And very often it takes not just money, because remember, money is just green paper or dots on a computer screen. It takes some combination of the money and relationships and health to be able to produce a more satisfying retirement. What the three have in common is that they're all investments. So what is an investment? An investment is a sacrifice that we can make today in order to live better in the future. So it's easy to see why A financial investment is an investment because that's money that I could have spent on going out to dinner today, or I could buy a nicer car or a bigger house, but instead I save it for the future so that I can live better in the future. So that's really the definition of what an investment is. But it also characterizes health. I can make an investment in my health today in order to live a more active and a longer retirement. And I can make investments in my relationships. I can go to visit a friend today. I can maintain those friendships that I have during my working years so that I can then draw on those in retirement.
All right, awesome. That's so interesting to hear about these investments, and we'll talk about more of that soon. So a lot of us understandably focus on planning for our retirement expenses and not as much about planning for our time. So how should we think about our lives in retirement? Or put in another way, how do we avoid becoming bored?
Well, I actually have a collection of photographs of couples sitting on the beach watching the ocean from financial services companies. It's kind of ubiquitous. In order to motivate people to save for retirement, you have to get them to imagine buying a beach house and then sitting in beach chairs and looking at the ocean. But the reality is that when you do that and you sit there looking at the ocean, after about half an hour, you probably start getting bored. And then you realize, well, this isn't it. One of the mistakes I think people make is that we think about retirement as being a very long weekend. And we think that many of the things that we enjoy doing on the weekend, like playing golf or, going out to the beach or going to the mountains, these are things to get away from a life where we've had a lot of structure, a lot of engagement, social engagement. We've had challenges in the workplace. And then the weekends are all about getting away from that. I mean, that creates a certain amount of balance in our lives. But in retirement, if that's all we do, then it can seem a bit imbalanced. So what ends up happening is that oftentimes people become socially isolated in retirement and they become bored. And you really have to think in advance about how you're going to fill your days. How are you going to get that same sense of fulfillment and engagement? And what I found is that it's very often about habits. It's about thinking ahead of time, what sort of habits am I going to develop? Because honestly, the number one time use among retirees, other than sleeping, is watching television. And if we can end up falling into, I think, a bit of a rut in retirement unless we plan for a more satisfying retirement. And I think a lot of that is really down to social engagement. One of the worst things that can happen is that we can become more socially isolated.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. Well, Julie, you see this in action every day when you work with clients. So how do you help your clients establish their vision of retirement?
Yeah, thanks, Susie. This is one of my favorite parts of the planning process because everyone's vision of retirement is so personal and unique. I always start by encouraging them to dream a little. I'll ask them, if you could design your perfect week in retirement, what would that look like? They don't usually tell me it's watching TV. Sometimes people are surprised by what they come up with, though. Let me share a story. I had a client who was really struggling with this. She had two big passions, a love for competitive ballroom dancing that she had enjoyed for years, and she knew she wanted to spend more time with her grandkids in retirement as well. She felt like she had to pick one over the other, and it was causing her a lot of stress. So we spent time talking about what each activity meant to her, how it contributed to her sense of purpose and happiness. And through these conversations, she realized she didn't have to choose. And we worked to create a retirement plan that allowed her to take dance classes a few times a week and also set aside dedicated time for her grandkids. And then we built in a budget both for dance trips and family trips. And what I've learned is that retirement isn't about giving up these things, but finding the right balance. And my role is to listen, ask thoughtful questions, and help clients see what their retirement can be both exciting and fulfilling.
Love that. Thank you so much, Julie. And I do love the idea of balance, and it's so important to find balance in all parts of your life, certainly. So, Michael, what has your research found about retirement expenses?
Yeah, I mean, I get this question a lot. What are my retirement expenses going to look like? And let's take a step back and think about what were my expenses like before I retired. And for a lot of people, they're not spending all of their salary. They're saving a portion of their salary. They might be saving 15% for retirement. They're paying payroll taxes. If you really want to replace the lifestyle that you had before retirement, it may be closer to about 60% for those higher earning Americans. So that's good news in the sense that that really is the lifestyle that you need to be able to replace. Now, it does make some sense to track that a bit before retirement. What I find is that retirees, the first year of retirement, spend almost exactly the same on average as they did the year before they retired because we're creatures of habit. We tend to live in the same house very often. We pay payroll or we pay property taxes on the house and utilities. We go to the grocery store. We tend to have the same lifestyle that we did before retirement. The expenses are a little bit different. Now, one of the big differences is that the research has found that there are some retirees who spend a lot more after they retire. I call them the RV retirees, the ones who decide that they're going to spend a lot of money on living it up, whether it's buying an RV or buying something else, going on vacation. But that tends to even out over time. And by the way, RVs are a great example of spending in retirement that some people get wrong and some people it's a great idea. So I have a friend who's a financial advisor, and whenever one of his clients would come in and say, I'm thinking of buying an RV after I retire, he'd say, that is a great idea. You get to see the country, you're going to have a wonderful time. Why don't you rent a mid-size RV for a month? And then what I find is that some of my clients, they want a little bit more space, so they end up buying a bigger motorhome, or some of them want something a little bit more compact and maneuverable. So rent a mid-size RV for a month. And he made that recommendation because he knew that about 2/3 of his clients, after spending a month in a motorhome, would never want to get in one again. So I thought that was brilliant. So what ends up happening is that there is a certain type of retiree who maybe gets in the motorhome, goes from one RV park to another, sees national parks or monuments, and then they get back to the park and then they plug in and watch cable TV and get up the next morning and go for a drive. They're basically underpaid truck drivers. And there's other types of RV owners that will get to the park and they'll put up a sign saying, hey, it's the Campbells, welcome, say hello. They use it as an opportunity for increased social engagement. And that's really the bottom line when it comes to spending on things like a motorhome or even a classic car. If it provides an entree into social engagement, then it's likely to be a successful purchase. So if you're someone who's always wanted to buy the classic car, then I think it's actually, especially for men, because men do become more vulnerable to social isolation in retirement, go ahead and buy the classic car because it's really entree into a social group. You get to, take the cars and coffee, and you get to go online and talk to other people that own the car. That's the kind of spending that really leads to the greatest amount of life satisfaction.
Well, I love the idea of social spending. I probably do I'm probably pretty good at that, let's just say. All right, well, speaking of expenses, housing is one of the biggest for many retirees. We covered this recently in a program. And so one of the biggest decisions many of us make about retirement is where to live. So Justin, what are your thoughts about that decision?
Yeah, now that we're in retirement and I don't have a employer holding me down, I can be more mobile and move around. However, there are some financial considerations to think about. And I think most of us want to anticipate or kind of, I guess, as those pictures show that Michael shared, maybe closer to a beach or in a more warmer climate. But there is going to be some costs. So here's a few questions to consider. Wherever I'm going to be looking at relocating, first of all, are those cost of living factors going to increase or decrease? Maybe if I get closer to the beach, all of a sudden I have flood insurance I'm going to have to start paying for, or something like that. So we have to make sure that we understand those costs. Also, we're probably going to be drawn to maybe where our taxes are going to be impacting us. Are there states with higher taxes or lower taxes? And maybe there's some local taxes that we need to be considerate of. Also, the hope, and I love what Michael's saying about social engagement. Hopefully, I'm going to move something closer to a hobby or an activity that makes me more interactive with others, maybe closer to family. But remember, maybe that's an activity that I haven't used or haven't been a part of, is that going to be increasing costs? So we just want to make sure that we know what we're signing up for and that we have budgeted for that. I'd say this though, I know we can go online. We can probably do some comparison pricing out there, but the best thing to do is actually, and I'd like to still that idea about the RV, maybe if I'm going to move to a location, maybe a warmer climate, maybe I rent for a little while so that I understand what are the neighborhoods instead of just going straight by, because maybe I don't want to be that close to the beach because I get tired of the sand and I'd rather live 5 miles in from the beach, right? And maybe my flood insurance is a little bit cheaper. But also talk to some of the professionals there, obviously family, friends, neighbors, but also real estate agents and others that would give you a good idea of what that cost would be. One more thing to consider is I think we're always thinking about those first handful of years of retirement, but maybe stretch us to think a little bit beyond that, maybe 10, 12, 15 years out, because this is a location of where we're going to be aging. So this is where I want to talk about aging costs. And I'm not talking long-term care. I'm just talking maybe there's a point I'm going to slow down. Maybe my faculties will get a little slower. Maybe I need some house upkeep. So what would that cost? Yard maintenance. Maybe I need some help with shopping. All those kind of things on top of, do I have access to the doctors that I'm going to need, some of the physical therapy, all those costs kind of come into the decision of where I want to locate.
All right, well, these are really good considerations, and I love the idea of what are some of the shorter term considerations and things to think about for the longer term as well. So, Michael, do you have any thoughts to add to this?
Yeah, Justin mentions that you need to give thoughts to the different stages of retirement, especially when it comes to housing. And research shows that if you're living in your own home, over the course of your lifetime, you're generally happier than people who are in more shared living types of environments, like apartments or condos, until you hit your 80s. And then once you hit your 80s, people who live in shared environments are actually happier than those who live in their own home. And I think one of the reasons is because as we get older, we do become more vulnerable to social isolation. We change physically, we change cognitively, and it's a little depressing, but fewer of our friends are around by the time we hit our 80s. So I think it's actually a good idea to plan ahead. Let's say at the very outset of retirement, you do a little bit of looking around for a type of living environment that you want to transition into, maybe 15, maybe 20 years into retirement, but you should recognize that you're going to actually prefer that kind of a living environment at some point. And what I see happening all too often is that it is very often the children or other friends of an older person who end up having to move them into a different living environment, but not necessarily on their own terms. So if you can do it on your own terms ahead of time, if you can make that choice in advance, it really saves a big burden off of those who have to make that decision for you. And it allows you to transition into the kind of place that you want to spend that latter part of retirement. So I think part of retirement planning is recognizing that there are these different stages, and you're probably going to be happier in some of those latter stages in a different type of living environment than your house.
All right, that's very helpful. So let's talk about investing in your health, a key pillar of retirement happiness. So, Michael, when you say that, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, so I did a study about a year ago with a guy named David Stewart. He has a website called superage.com, and David is very big on healthy aging. And his idea is that, aging is an aspirational life cycle stage. We can enjoy our lives into our 60s, 70s, and 80s, but it requires a certain level of physical capabilities. And I want to, when I get to retirement, go hiking in Switzerland. And so, of course, I need to save up to be able to fly there. I need to rent a chalet, but I also need to be physically able to go for a hike in the mountains. And that's not easy. It requires a certain level of fitness. And there is this thing called VO2 max, which is our body's ability to process oxygen. And it tends to decline as we get older, but it doesn't decline as much if we're more physically physically fit. So we can actually make an investment in our physical fitness. And I bought one of those expensive watches that tracks my VO2 max, and it's actually motivated me to maintain my fitness. If the number starts going down, then I realize I have to exercise a little bit more. But I'm doing it because I'm motivated by living better in the future. And I think it's something to keep in mind when you're my age, maybe a decade out of retirement, that it's not just I need to save enough money. Oftentimes we think of retirement planning as a numbers game, but it's also going to require an investment both in friendships and in health. And if I don't make that investment in health, what is the use of the money? It's not going to be as enjoyable.
Well, I love that idea of being motivated by wellness. So, besides investing in wellness, what are some strategies to plan for covering later in life healthcare expenses? Justin, can you help us with that, please?
Yeah, so based on some of our recent research from Fidelity, the average 65-year-old individual who's retired will spend about 165,000 over their retirement lifetime just on healthcare. So that's all the out-of-pocket cost and Medigap policy coverage and so forth. Now, luckily, that's not all at one time, because 165,000 is a big number, and that's going to be spread out. Of course, a lot of that might be showing up towards the end of our life. In addition to that, that's not including if we end up needing long-term care. That could be an additional 117,000 per person just for the average private room nursing care. So there's some cost there. I like it though, because we are, I don't like the cost, but I do like that we're investing in our health and that will extend our living. So a couple of things to keep in mind. The first strategy that I would say is sit down and budget with us. So it's not a complicated strategy, but we have some software here at Fidelity that we can help you with a budget. And this particular line item of healthcare, we actually do inflate that at a higher than above average, because healthcare tends to be increasing, unfortunately, faster than other things that go up on inflation, because we want to make sure that that expense will be covered and that we will have the resources to access it. Because the more I access it and use it, the better I'm going to feel. So that would be number one. Number two, what typically happens is as I get older, late 70s, early 80s, even into my 90s, of course, I'm just going to access more healthcare, and I'm probably going to need more therapeutics and therapy and medicines and so forth. So let's plan for that particular increase of expense. One way that we can use that or anticipate that is use a thing called a QLAC. Now, I know that's an odd word. It's actually an acronym. It's QLAC. The Treasury Department actually issued a rule about almost 15 years ago that basically said a qualified longevity annuity contract. That's what it stands for. What that means is I can take a sum of my IRA money, so pre-tax money, and I can put it with an insurance company. The insurance company will then invest it, and at a certain point, usually in my early 80s, but not past age 85, I can turn on that annuity to create payments for me to hopefully offset some of these rising costs, especially around healthcare. So just to give you an example, I ran a quote on a QLAC about 2 weeks ago, and if I had transferred $200,000 at age 70, and then I planned on turning that income on to offset some of my healthcare at age 85. So it's in there for about 15 years. I turn on, that would produce about $78,000 worth of additional cash flow coming in. Now, once that's coming in, just keep in mind that 78,000, because that did come from an IRA. I will have to account as that as taxable income. But there is a sweetener there that the government has allowed us, which is that 200,000 out of my IRA that I put into the QLAC. I don't have to include it as part of my RMD calculation. So I get a little tax savings there, obviously to help me offset some of the cash flow needs that I'm going to have as I age.
All right, that was a helpful example. You had mentioned long-term care. So what are some ways that you can pay for long-term care?
Okay, so here's a sobering stat. 70% of us will spend some time in long-term care. So 30% of us won't, 70 will. So that's a lot of us. And it is going to be a considerable amount. So we should anticipate it and not know it now or avoid it. So here's the thing. we don't have time. Like, this is an easy 30 to 40-minute conversation on long-term care. And we have tons of resources on our website with videos and articles. So really encourage you. But at a super high level, for most of us, there's going to be 4 ways that we are going to cover our long-term care need. Number one is probably the default is personal savings, right? I'm just going to have to sell something and pay for long-term care. The second way is actually government assistance. So if I qualify for Medicaid, or if I'm a veteran, there's a VA benefit, and thank you out there for your service, but you would have that government assistance to cover for your long-term care. The last 2 is really where I'm getting more thoughtful, and I'm trying to put some insurance policies in place, like a traditional long-term care policy where I'm paying a premium in, and I'm going to get usually a daily amount when a triggering event takes place. Or the last one is what's really is probably grown in more popularity, is what we call the hybrid long-term policy, where, for example, I have a life insurance policy connected with long-term care. So if I'm the 30% that doesn't need it, then the life insurance kicks in. If I'm the 70% that will need long-term care, it'll kick in. So it's kind of addressing a couple of different things. Now, just one thing to consider, because most people that I talk to, they just kind of default to, well, I'm just going to pay for my personal savings. One thing that I want to really make sure that you understand, long-term care is not determined by age, it's determined by event, when I'm not able to do certain tasks. We assume that that'll be, and I hope it is going to be in our 80s and 90s and maybe in our hundreds. I hope that everyone's going to make it into a centenarian status here on the call here. But the reality is sometimes it might be in our 60s. It might be in our early 70s. I might just have an accident and I had a brain injury, or maybe I had a stroke when I'm 62. You might know somebody like that. Am I prepared when I'm 62 to write a sizable check? If I have some coverage, that money becomes available immediately. There is no age limit. It's all about my ability to do tasks. So that's number one consideration, is just time. We don't know exactly when we're going to need it. Number 2, if I do have self-pay, and I have talked to many investors, Justin, I've been super successful. My assets have grown. I've been really blessed. And I could write a check at 62, not a problem. Wonderful. Then I'll always ask this follow-up question, and I would just ask everyone to think about this. What is whoever your caregiver, because likely you're not going to probably have the faculties to make these money decisions if I'm in long-term care, what are we going to sell to fund it? And I've had too many times when adult children come in with their power of attorney, so there was at least some preparation ready for this. They say, Dad's in care, we need X amount of money, what should we do? And did Dad ever talk, are we selling this? Are we getting rid of a real estate piece of property? What are we going to do? There's no liquidation plan. So you need to have at least a liquidation plan. I would argue that a long-term care policy helps with that, because again, it's triggered by the event, not by age. So you can tap the policy and have that liquidation and keep all your other assets basically intact, at least for a longer period of time. So a couple of considerations.
Well, Justin, thank you for breaking down long-term care for us really quickly in that short period of time. Appreciate it. All right, well, let's turn to our third pillar, money and savings. Now, how do you know if you've actually saved enough to retire? Julie, help us, please.
Yeah, this is probably the question I hear the most often, and it's completely understandable. Retirement is a huge transition. On the financial side, it can feel very overwhelming. The first step is to get a clear understanding of what your expenses will be in retirement. Get really granular. I encourage clients to track their expenses for a few months. Think about how that might change once they are no longer working. We look at everything, the basics, so housing, food, utilities, but also the fun stuff, travel, hobbies, and those bucket list experiences. Once we have a detailed picture, we use our planning and guidance tool that takes all those numbers, projects them forward, factors in things like inflation, investment growth, potential healthcare costs. As Justin mentioned, we inflate things at different levels. And this is a great process to go through. And it's really not just about crunching the numbers, but about building confidence in our plan. I love seeing the relief on clients' faces when they realize, oh, I can really afford to do this. I can really afford to do all the things I care about. And if the analysis does show a gap, then we can work together to adjust the plan, maybe working longer, spending less, finding new sources of income. But ultimately, it's about creating that roadmap to let you enjoy your retirement, provide that peace of mind, and knowing you're prepared for both the expected and the unexpected.
That's fantastic. And if I may ask the opposing question, so what do people typically get wrong about their expenses in retirement?
Yeah, great question. The two biggest misconceptions I see are first, underestimating healthcare costs, and second, not accounting for those periodic or more lumpy expenses that just don't happen every month. So healthcare is a big one. People often assume Medicare will cover everything, but there are still premiums, deductibles, out-of-pocket expenses, dental, vision, prescriptions. And as we age, those do tend to go up. So we want to make sure we're accounting for that. And like Justin mentioned, long-term care or specialized treatments too wouldn't be covered. The other is those irregular expenses, things like needing a new car every 5 or 10 years, major home repairs, big family events. Maybe you're paying for a wedding or a big milestone birthday trip. Most people are pretty good at budgeting the regular stuff, the cell phone bill, the utilities, the property taxes, but it's those infrequent things that can throw a wrench in the plan if you're not prepared. The one thing I do want to point out, though, is the good news is many retirees are very surprised to find that with proper planning, their wealth can actually continue to grow in retirement. Thanks to market growth, smart investment strategies, your nest egg doesn't have to shrink every year. And in fact, I see many clients end up with more wealth later in retirement than they expected or than they first retired with, which really opens up to more goal setting around maybe giving or travel they weren't expecting, legacy planning. So the key is really to be as thorough as possible when estimating the retirement expenses and then revisit regularly as your life changes.
Great wisdom, and I love the idea of being open to some of these possibilities. Now, can you talk more about some of those essential expenses and how those might change over time?
Yeah, this is such an interesting topic. There's some great research out there. David Blanchett's work on the retirement smile comes to mind. He found that retirement spending isn't a straight line. It tends to follow a curve, one that looks like a smile. In the early years, we sometimes call that the go-go years. People are often more active. They're traveling, picking up new hobbies, maybe helping out with grandkids. And then they move into the slow-go years, maybe in their late 70s, early 80s. Spending tends to drop. Travel slows down. Hobbies might become less physically demanding. People tend to stay closer to home. Daily expenses can decrease, but you still need to plan for the basics and a comfortable lifestyle. And then finally, those no-go years, expenses tend to rise again, primarily due to healthcare and potential long-term care needs. So it's important to have a flexible plan that can adapt and change as your lifestyle does over time. Understanding this pattern does tend to provide more confidence about a retirement plan, and because we can expect to prepare for those shifts in spending.
Right, helpful. Let's think of a scenario here. Now, if spouses don't retire at the same time, what does that mean for their financial plan? Justin, help us.
Yeah, it's getting less and less common that everyone retires and that everything's perfectly planned, that we're all going to retire right on January 1st of this X date. Tends to be this transition period, especially if something happens to one spouse, like I get downsized, or maybe there's a healthcare issue, that maybe I have to retire a little earlier, maybe late 50s, early 60s, while another spouse continues to work. So a couple of considerations just to put this on your radar. Ultimately, I just want to make sure we have a plan. Unfortunately, sometimes we take off the financial advisor hat and put on the therapist hat when there's been friction. And I tend to find the biggest friction between spouses is we just weren't on the same page. So a couple of quick questions that I would ask in this kind of scenario when I have one retired and one like delaying and still working for a little longer. Number one, the person that's retiring, we've now lost their paycheck. Is that a big deal? Can we live on the other spouse's paycheck or not? Or do we need to start generating some income from either our investments in order to replace some of that cash flow to make the whole household work. That might push us to start thinking about, when do I file for Social Security, especially if I'm earlier, maybe early 60s. Just keep in mind, I can file at age 62, but full retirement or full benefit from Social Security is actually age 67. So if I do file at 62, 63, 64, something earlier, I am getting a reduced benefit from my Social Security. So how does that weigh into that? Is that okay? The other thing is not so much maybe cash flow related, but is there a benefit by having my spouse retire early that I'm going to be leaving with the paycheck? So maybe that is a healthcare benefit. And just keep in mind, right, I'm not going to qualify for Medicare until age 65. And so do we have to pick up some of that, or does the other working spouse will be able to cover that maybe through an employer healthcare plan? So how does that work together? And obviously there might be some other benefits to keep in mind. We'll obviously lose probably a little bit of 401k match, maybe a bonus, maybe some profit sharing. So just those are considerations. I just want to make sure everyone's on the page. I'll just end with this though. One other thing to be on the page: if I retired early and my wife is still working, and I went to the gym in the morning, I took my nap in the afternoon, and she came home at 6 and there's still dishes in the sink, that will be a problem. So always be on the same time who does what at the house.
Amazing. I'm sure that's probably a common problem even today, not when you're retired. Well, so of course, not everyone is planning with a partner. And for single people, what kind of additional investments might they need to make? Julie, I imagine you see this daily as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important topic too. For single retirees, investing in relationships is just as important as the financial investments. I can think of one client particularly. I work with a retired nurse. She's a great example of this. Throughout her career, she built strong connections with the younger nurses she worked with. Now she's retired. She still meets them for lunch regularly and has very open conversations about her wishes on how she wants to age, where she wants to be, and of course the financial side that goes along with that. And they've all agreed to support her almost like a chosen family. So for singles, having those conversations, whether it's with friends, family, or community, is key. And think about your support network and don't be afraid to invest the time and energy in those relationships.
It's amazing. And I think of your chosen family for holidays as well. Well, we know that spending in retirement can be a source of stress for retirees, even those who have saved enough to cover their expenses. So what can help alleviate that stress, Justin?
Yeah, I think it comes down to when you know where the money's coming from, then you have that confidence and less stress. If I don't know where the money's going to come and how these bills are going to get paid, then that creates greater stress. So really the first stop here in addressing this, Julie actually mentioned it. It's about figuring out in our budget what is essential and what is discretionary. So the essentials are the have-tos. I have to have this to have my, to sustain my life. Now, here's the one thing: whenever I've mentioned that word essential or what have to, especially with a couple, it conjures up two different ideas. There are some that are happy to live on ramen noodles and plastic furniture, and others that don't, right? And they don't consider that essential. So I would say this: what is essential? Yes, there are basic things that we need to survive, but you know what? Let's not just survive retirement. Let's actually thrive. So what does that mean? And I know Michael's already mentioned it. There are other things that are important: our social interaction, obviously healthcare. Those are also essential. So one way that I ask that is, what gets you excited for the day, to get up, get going? What is it about that in retirement that's going to engage you? I consider whatever that is, fill in the blank, that is essential. And if there's some financial support to make that happen, then I would put that in the essential category. Now, the second category is the discretionary. It's what I call the nice to have. And with the nice to have, yes, it's wonderful, it's great, but I don't need it, or I can skip it for 6 months. What we typically do, if we can break down the budget between this is truly essential and this is truly on the discretionary, then we can go to the next step, backing into how do we align our cash flow. So now that I don't have a paycheck, How do I take my 401k balance, my IRA balances, my Roth? How do we then organize the investments around supporting what is essential and then also what is on the discretionary side?
All right, well, let's focus a little bit on some of this guaranteed income that you mentioned. So, Julie, what are typical sources of guaranteed income, and how can that help alleviate spending stress?
When we talk about guaranteed income in retirement, we're really talking about the sources you can rely on to provide steady, predictable payments, no matter what the market's doing. And the most common source, of course, is going to be Social Security. For most Americans, Social Security forms the foundation of their retirement income. It's a monthly payment adjusted for inflation, lasts for the lifetime, and it provides a lot of peace of mind for a lot of people. The second source of guaranteed income we see would be pensions. We're seeing fewer and fewer pensions today. Typically, we see pensions from government employees, retired military, or teachers. They're not as common from corporate plans as they used to be. In the 17 years I've been doing this, I've seen a significant decrease in the number of clients receiving pensions, or maybe it's only a partial pension in some cases too. The third example of guaranteed income would be insured income, income guaranteed by an annuity. An annuity is designed to turn a lump sum of savings into a stream of income, often for life. There are different types: immediate annuities, deferred annuities, fixed or variable, but the key benefit is they provide a guaranteed monthly payment. Income guaranteed by an annuity can potentially reduce some of the financial concerns or the stress and provide more confidence.
All right, well, Michael, what does your research tell us about how income influences retirement happiness?
Yeah, as Julie just mentioned, most retirees rely primarily on Social Security to provide them with a regular paycheck in retirement. And in a former era, you used to have what was known as the three-legged stool of retirement security. So one leg was Social Security, another leg was savings, and another leg was income through a pension. Now, people are not getting a pension anymore, but they do sort of carry their pension around on their back in their defined contribution plan, their 401k. So oftentimes people will arrive at retirement with a lot of money saved in their IRA, but they won't have a whole lot of money in that private income part of the three-legged stool. And I feel like this is a different state of being for a lot of retirees, and they're not as comfortable about spending money out of savings as they were of income. And in fact, I've done some research where I find that retirees who have income will spend significantly more than retirees with an equal amount of wealth. In other words, let's say you had $500,000 that you could use to buy $3,000 a month of income with an annuity, or you just have the $500,000 in investments. If you have the income, you're going to spend a lot more. So one of the reasons why you're going to spend more with an income is because of what's known as longevity risk. And I have an example that I very often give to help people understand the concept of longevity risk and why people don't spend enough in retirement when they just hold investment assets. And it's to imagine that it is your son's birthday, and you've invited somewhere between 5 and 40 kids that are going to show up for the birthday party. And they all arrive one at a time. And when they walk through the door, you have to cut them a slice of cake. So you have a single large birthday cake. You're going to get somewhere between 5 and 40 kids that are going to walk through the door. The first kid comes in, and you have to decide how big of a slice of the birthday cake to cut. Well, you know there could be 35 kids coming through the door, so you're not going to cut it into 20 slices, even if on average 20 kids are going to show up to the birthday party. So you cut a smaller slice of cake. And then let's say 30 kids come through the door and you're running out of cake and you're starting to get nervous. You cut even smaller slices. Now, what if instead there was a bakery who would make you a deal? They do 1,000 of these birthday parties every year. So they say, well, just pay a little bit more for the birthday cake, but you can slice it into exactly 20 slices, because on average, 20 kids are going to show up. And if more than 20 kids show up, then we will arrive with a second birthday cake, and you can again cut it into 20 pieces. So the end result is that each kid gets a bigger slice of cake, and I worry less about potentially running out. which of course would be a tragedy if a kid comes in and there's no more cake left. I mean, they would cry, they would go to their parents, you'd not get invited to any more parties in the neighborhood. So you're always going to naturally be more conservative. You do the same thing with your retirement savings. You don't know how long you're going to live. So you end up cutting your savings into smaller slices because you're so worried about potentially running out. You can actually transfer what's known as that idiosyncratic risk. You get no reward for taking that risk. You can transfer it to an institution, in this case, an insurance company, and essentially spend as if you're going to live to about the average longevity. And if you live longer than that, then the insurance company is going to be on the hook for making those additional payments. And the fact that a lot of people don't do this, they don't buy themselves something that looks like a private paycheck every month, is a puzzle. It's actually called the annuity puzzle, and it's something that a scientist that study retirement income wonder why more people don't take a part of their savings and turn it into income if it will cause them to spend more and worry less.
All right, that was a super helpful analogy. I am terrified of 40 children running into my house now. But let's talk about annuities a little bit more. So Justin, you broke it down, long-term care, gave us the quick version. Can you tell us, for clients who need an additional source of guaranteed income, how might annuities help?
Yeah. So, and I don't want any screaming kids that didn't get cake either. So, typically we're just trying to get enough income to cover the essentials, right? Because remember, annuities typically don't grow. They're not going to grow, at least the ones we're talking about here. And obviously our pensions and Social Security don't grow. So I do need some other element of growth. But let me be clear what we're talking about. Because when I say the word annuity, and I wish I could see everyone's face right now because there's always a variation of faces and reactions. I'm talking about an income annuity, or another term, it's a jargon term in the industry. It's called a single premium income annuity. Now, what is that? It is the no bells, no whistles type of an annuity. I just put money with the insurance company and they just pay it income amount for the rest of my life. There's no any additional bells or whistles, and they're contractually obligated to pay that for the rest of my life. Just like Social Security, I pay into Social Security with my taxes. They promise, the government, to pay me for the rest of my life. My employer pays into a pension. Usually I accept a lower compensation. I'm talking to some of our government worker friends out there. I'm accepting less for that pension. It's actually part of your compensation for that promise that they're going to pay you for the rest of life. So it's all the same thing where we won't have to worry about running out of money. But the key is, how much should I actually allocate? Again, the starting point is, where is our essentials? Because on the discretionary, we still got to grow. All of these guarantee sources typically are probably not going to keep up with our cost of living over time. So we have to also allocate money towards a growth side.
All right, well, guaranteed income is definitely important. But most of us also withdraw from our savings in retirement. There's a common assumption that says it's safe to withdraw about 4% of your savings per year, known as the 4% rule. Michael, now what has your research found about this?
So let's begin with what the 4% rule is, because I get that question a lot. The 4% rule, which was created by a financial advisor named Bill Bengen back in 1994, what Bill did was he tried to estimate how much you could have withdrawn from your investments the first year. So the 4% part is actually only relevant for the first year. So let's say you have $1 million. According to the 4% rule, you can safely withdraw $40,000 the first year and then adjust that by the rate of inflation every year. So eventually you're going to be spending probably more than 4% of your investments in the future because you're going to be withdrawing money from your savings. Now, but what Bill found was that historically there seems to be about this floor, where if you'd invested in stocks and bonds in the United States over the course of a 30-year time horizon, you shouldn't run out if you begin with $40,000 from $1 million portfolio and then increase it by the rate of inflation every year. Now, that was 1994. There's some differences between today and back when Bill originally did that study that would make the 4% rule maybe a little bit less secure. A lot of retirees are living beyond that 30-year time horizon. Many asset managers estimate that returns on stocks and bonds in the future are probably going to be a little bit lower than they have been in the past. So it's a little little bit less secure. However, it's also a very conservative rule because it tries to avoid running out of money if you make no adjustments and you increase your spending by the rate of inflation, which, as Julie said before, most retirees don't do that. They actually start spending a little bit less in their mid 70s. So you don't necessarily have to keep increasing your income by the rate of inflation because you're probably not going to spend as much mid-retirement as you did early on in retirement. So my preference is to follow what I like to call a flexible spending strategy. So maybe you can start a little bit higher. Start at $45,000 per year, maybe even a little bit more, but then be willing to adjust your spending downward or even upward. If the market does well and you get very lucky in retirement, you should be able to get some reward for that by being able to spend more. But I think if you can be more flexible, then you can reduce the likelihood that you have to worry about running out of money later on in retirement because you're spending a little bit less if the markets don't give you a very high return.
Oh, well, that was awesome. Now, panelists, you have given our viewers so much to think about during this robust discussion. But before we sign off, could each of you share a few key takeaways? So, Julie, let's start with you, please.
Yeah, my one key takeaway from today is that there are 3 important investments you can make: your money, your health, and your relationships. And each play a vital role in creating a fulfilling and secure retirement. And it's worth investing in all 3 equally. I encourage you to sit down with your Fidelity representative to explore how your financial plan can help support all the things that matter the most.
Excellent. Justin, how about you?
Yeah, I just want everyone to remember we're not trying to survive retirement. We want to thrive. I really hope everyone's retirement is their best chapter yet in their life, because now we have this open free time. And if we sit down with us and we'll work out all the math and the numbers and help you figure out budgets and cash flow and get that all done so you can engage in what you are really passionate about and take advantage of this opportunity in front of you.
Excellent. And Michael, let's close with you.
I think one of the best news that we can get from the research is that retirees are actually happier. So people tend to be happier after they retire than they were when they were working. So retirement is a good thing. It's a goal that makes sense. It's something to work for. But then why does retirement make us happy? I think the biggest reason is that it gives us autonomy. It gives us control over what we do with our time. And so it's whether it's working because it doesn't mean that we should not work again as long as we're doing something that we enjoy, or if it's our hobbies or travel or socializing. The best pathway to a successful retirement is to plan on spending our time doing whatever makes us the happiest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, if you have more questions about planning for your retirement, please reach out to your Fidelity representative. If you don't have a representative, visit fidelity.com/find an advisor. And for more timely market updates and insights on other financial planning topics, subscribe to Insights from Fidelity Wealth Management for exclusive invitations to future wealth management webinars and access to our weekly newsletter. Thank you so much for joining us.